Okay, colleagues, thank you so much. Right, we are now with Roundtable 5, Beyond Higher Education as We Know It. But just a short notice, the one is that the Black Academic Experience book has been sold out yesterday, and we are struggling to get copies here in time, but it's on Take-A-Lot and it's on Amazon, okay? And my team has been trying, and we just couldn't get it right, okay? So you can send it to us, and of course we'll get it signed and then send it back to you, okay? Right. I'm going to hand over to Tshepo now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, colleagues. So we are moving into the second last roundtable, Emancipatory Imaginations Beyond Higher Education as We Know It. We've got three speakers, Sharon, Stein, Crain, Soudien, and Relebohile, Moletsane. I won't read their bio, they are in your packs, so we don't need to waste time with that. I'm very excited by this session where we are trying to look beyond higher education as we know it. And I'm glad that the way it is framed, it is higher education, so not just universities. I think we've been focusing too much on universities. We've not said anything about TVET colleges. We've not said anything about other colleges. So I hope, and I'm putting pressure on the speakers to say something about that. But the notion of emancipation has been coming up over and over and over again. And I hope this panel will finally delve deeper into the question of emancipation. What is an emancipatory university? What is an emancipating university? We know that the university can never be decolonized, right? We know that it can never be decolonized. At most, the university can be transformed. Can be transformed, not decolonized. In fact, if you see all our post-2015 initiatives, they've been geared towards transformation, inclusion, integration, epistemological diversity, epistemological populism, let's call it that. Transformation, right? Without changing the fundamental power structures of the university. So what is emancipation? So you've got this multiculturalism. We are including certain black scholars in our curriculum as bodies. So the dish is still a westernized dish, but we seem to be spicing it up, seasoning it with black thought and black scholars. What is emancipation? What is the limit of emancipation? And how do we get over that? How do we get over that? So that's the one side of the limit, where top managers, just like the state, just like the World Bank, very adept at cannibalizing emancipatory discourse to legitimize and to renew the westernized university, right? So top managers are embarking on these PR exercises, decolonial this, decolonial that. Money is pouring in, but the power structures remain the same. The power structures remain the same. So the limit of emancipation. The other limit we see on the other side, those of us who are advocating for decolonization, who are advocating for decoloniality, where we are advocating for these things, but we are falling into the trap of colonialist thinking, where we talk about black and white culture. It's not black and white culture. That's colonialist thinking, where we are going back to nativism, going back to artivism, in the name of decolonization. The other limits you see it when we say we don't want Western scholarship anymore, but we are parachuting in discourse from Latin America. I mean, you'll have noticed yesterday that the three speakers in the book launch only reference Latin American speakers, Mingolo, Ramon Kuzfogel. So, what is this emancipation where we are once again parachuting discourses from elsewhere? Can theory travel? Edward Said once asked us. We don't know whether it can travel. The limits of emancipation. The limits of emancipation. Yesterday I had the honor of helping launch the Decolonization reading group, reading club. The students invited me to help launch it. And it was wonderful, 2 hours of robust debates. And there were a lot of takeaways. I will just highlight some of the takeaways. One of them was really a lament that the students are not part of these discourses. Where are the students here? Where are the students? The students feel that they've been evacuated from this kind of debates, even though they were at the forefront of calling for these kind of things, where students themselves put their bodies on the line. Most of them are expelled. Most of them are suffering from anxiety, depression, and so forth. But they're not here. So students see, some of us as cultural imperialists, We don't include students in this. By the way, I didn't take notes. It was long, it was 2 hours. But there were certain takeaways. The one takeaway that came through from the discussion was the struggle for hunger. The struggle of hunger. Students are hungry. Students said it's well and good that you talk about emancipation, decoloniality, transformation. Excellent. But we are hungry. We don't have food. Some of us are sitting here. We have not had a meal. How do we square that in our transformation agenda? The struggle for hunger. Not just hunger for big concepts. As Amiga Cabral said, people don't eat ideas. People don't eat ideas. The struggle for hunger. The second question that came up over and over again is the question of whether can you have a decolonized university in a neo-colonial society? What does it mean to have a decolonized university in a neo-apartheid, neo-colonial society? How does the framework of a post-apartheid / neo-apartheid society set the limit for a decolonized society? And therefore, it is the responsibility of students in decolonizing society. And this is one of the objectives of this reading group. They don't see themselves just as people who will be coming and reading, but they see themselves preparing themselves to work beyond the ivory tower. The third thing that came out over and over again was a question of language. Can you decolonize using a colonial language? English is a colonial language, we know that. We can say there are many Englishes and we have decolonized English, but it's still a colonial language. So at my previous university, the University of Pretoria, we did away with Afrikaans, but we celebrate that we still have English. What does that mean? What does that mean? We know the debate between Ngugi wa Thiong'o on the one hand and Soyinka on the other, where Ngugi wa Thiong'o said, language is very important. And Tshepo said, no, what is important is what we say and how we use English. So that came over and over again. And the last thing that students were referencing a lot is the limits of the adjectivizing game. The game that we play with adjectives. The adjectivizing game. Critical university, women-centered university, decolonial university. We play the games of adjectives without changing the power structures. Without changing the power structures, right? So this is some of the takeaways from the Decolonization Reading Group. It was the start of it yesterday, and students hope to continue with it. And I hope Krishet will give it a support. I've said too much. I'm a lawyer. I think I'm the only exception here. As a lawyer, so lawyers are also preachers. So I should not take too much time. So you've got 3 wonderful presenters. Will decolonize the order and go from the last this way. Not what to start. Sharon, will start with you, please. Thank you.
Okay, so whenever I enter a new space, I try to spend most of my time listening, so I'm a bit nervous that I have to talk. because there's a lot of learning and unlearning that has to happen, I think, before we open our mouths, but here I am doing it. And I'm still trying to discern from yesterday how the conversations in this context relate to my own, and I'm afraid I'm not quite able to draw those lines for you, but what I'm going to do is just offer the kinds of conversations that are happening in my context. And I would also say that they're also at the margins of whatever critical university studies is. And my emphasis actually in any area that I tend to work on is about the possibilities of that intervention, but also its limitations, its paradoxes, and its contradictions. So I'm the killjoy usually. So I guess I want to start with theories of change, and this came up yesterday. So I tend to think of theories of change as having two main parts. It's a diagnosis of the problem and a proposition about what the response should be. And sometimes the proposition follows from the diagnosis, but sometimes they're contradictory, especially if the proposition that would logically follow is really inconvenient or uncomfortable. But generally, if I look at critical higher education literature, I find three main theories of change. And I map these because I do want to disabuse us of the idea that we're all agreeing, because I think we can have a general shared problem of concern, but actually approach it from really different ways. And when we assume that we're approaching it from the same way, it can work for a while, but then we start to see that actually those might be our projections. And I think it's useful to clarify, not in order to come to a consensus in the end or to debate who's right or wrong, but just to see what the different theories of change offer and what they preclude. So the first theory I would call soft reform, and it's this kind of adding and mixing in without really changing much of anything. So you keep the world as it is, but you make a few changes. You still have this single story of progress and development. And the critique is really emphasizing methodological changes. Okay, we'll do this differently, but we're not really going to think about it differently. And it's really about how can we be more effective and more inclusive. Once you start to see that this theory of change rests on the same epistemological assumptions as the existing no reform space, you say, okay, maybe we need something more radical. Maybe we need to shift the epistemological frames that we're working with. So we're not just putting different bodies in the space, but we're actually inviting them to center their voices and not just having that tokenism, but actually redistributing resources as well. So this then is challenged by a more beyond reform space, what I call, which tries to emphasize that even with epistemological difference, you can be working from the same ontology, from the same way of being. And actually recognizing that modernity, coloniality, if we're putting them together, is not only about a way of thinking, but also about a way of being, a habit of being. And it's quite difficult to interrupt people's habits of being. You can change their thinking actually more easily than you can change their habit of being, because their habit of being is the thing that offers them all those colonial entitlements and desires. And I'm speaking about, from the global north context, thinking about myself and my students and colleagues as well. So the beyond reform analysis, which would be neither rebellion nor repair. If we're thinking about the pot from yesterday, it's starting with the assumption that the pot is actually already broken, and it actually can't or shouldn't be repaired. It's neither ethically something we want to repair, and feasibly not something we can repair, because the modern colonial system is inherently unsustainable, especially ecologically so. So if this is the case, how do we face the end of this system? Something we talk about in my research collective is about hospicing. So if this system is dying, it's neither that you put it on life support and give it a feeding tube to keep it going when it's really run its course, but nor do you smother it with a pillow. You figure out how it can die with dignity, learning all of the lessons it has to teach, so that when something else becomes possible, you don't make the same mistakes over again. So the communities I work with, both in Canada, but also in Latin America, have set their horizons of hope beyond the things that the pot has allowed us to do. So beyond modern forms of economy, including capitalism and socialism, beyond nation states as borders, as the mediators of our relationships and of our politics, beyond the separation of humans from nature, beyond a single story of progress and development, beyond social mobility as the purpose of life, and beyond consumption as a mode of relating to the world. So these communities don't offer answers or solutions to the problems that modernity has created, but they show us that something else is possible. And we have to learn to relate to them, especially in the global north perspective, without consuming them or instrumentalizing them or commodifying them, which is really difficult for people to do. So I know I need to shut up soon. The subtitle of this panel is, I think, comes from a paper I wrote called Beyond Higher Education as We Know It, Gesturing Towards Decolonial Horizons of Possibility. And this comes from, inspired by César and then taken up by Denise Ferreira da Silva, who's a black feminist scholar. And they say decolonization requires no less than the end of the world as we know it, which is not the end of the world, but the end of the modern colonial habit of being. And if I think about the fact that the planet is dying and has been dying for 500 years since the initiation of colonialism, I think it's not only about beyond higher education as we know it, but how higher education that we have now might prepare us for the end of the world as we know it, so that when this thing actually cracks, other possibilities open up and we don't just cling to the idea that we can only repair it. And this idea of crisis as both a challenge and a possibility. So how can we keep those possibilities open without making the same pottery over and over again? I think I'll stop.
5 minutes, excellent.
Okay, Dumela. I think my starting point is my growing disillusionment with the decolonization project and my increasing feeling that our institutions are using the notion of decolonization as a metaphor for very different things that individual institutions and the system as a whole feel that needs to be done. So my starting point is that decolonization is not and must not be a metaphor. The second point I want to start from is, I know that yesterday, at least that's what Viv told me, you spoke about the idea of an African it's still to come. The notion of an African, creating an African university. And the work of Mahmoud Mamdani. In particular, I stumbled upon this essay in 2018 where he's lamenting the ways in which African universities resemble the colonial or the universities of the empire, the British Empire. And I'll come back to that. In thinking about these 2 points, I would also like to say the words we use matter. And I preface this because when I say this at my institutions, the students almost want to stone me out of the lecture room. Our love affair with pedagogies or discourses of disadvantage. In the few minutes that we've been in this room, we've referred, for example, to the Fortes, to the universities of Zululand, Limpopo, etc., as this historically disadvantaged universities. I want to propose that actually the words that we use, the language that we use in describing ourselves or in positioning ourselves as the Fortes, as the University of Zululand, as black people, as women, as often suggests or often limits the possibilities for imagining what could be possible. That's one thing. And linked to this, I think that the idea of disadvantage is often linked to the notion that we somehow, those of us who are regarded as disadvantaged, we are somehow yearning to be allowed onto this proverbial table, right? We want to be admitted into the elite table of, dare I say it, whiteness, right? And of the North. So we yearn to be admitted to this table. Perhaps this is made even more visible by the neoliberal policies our universities have so enthusiastically embraced. The performative expectations on academics. For example, the UCTs, the universities of Pretoria, the Wits University, in striving to be #1 according to global rankings, put pressure on academics to perform so that those rankings can be maintained. And that has got nothing to do with addressing social issues in South Africa. It has everything to do in accessing the proverbial table that I've just talked about. The alternative, I think I would suggest very simply, is how about we dismantle the table, do away with the table, do away with the proverbial table to which we want to sit. And the proverbial table in this instance also allows us to have particular ways of relating. And Kawekazi talked about that, those ways of relating that are so problematic for differently constituted bodies in the academy. So how about we do away with the table and instead look to perhaps in indigenous African ways of relating. When I grew up, I used to visit my uncle who was a Morena. And I don't want to use the colonial term of the chief. He was a Morena of our community. And I used to watch him talk at the Lekgotla with the community, and everybody used to sit on the floor. And for me, I didn't think of it as a child, but looking back, I see that as having flattened the hierarchy in the community. Everybody sat on the floor and everybody talked as equals in the floor. So how about the academy? We throw away the way we hierarchize. Is that a word? Yes. I don't care, it's not my language. The way we hierarchize. For example, the way we have arranged the university. There's the Vice-Chancellor, and then there are professors, and then there are fee-paying students who sort of continue to beg and to negotiate ways of being heard within this institution. Whereas if we had a Lekgotla where everybody sat on the floor, I think that would be one way of ensuring that some voices are heard. Linked to this is the need then to find ways of addressing and challenging the silences and the silencing that often happens in university spaces. And again, I go back to Kaweka's presentation this morning, and I'm asking us, how do we create opportunities or strategies or tools where those silences are unearthed and where different voices can then be heard? I think I will stop there for now. So addressing the words that we use to describe ourselves, and instead, for example, moving away from the pedagogy of disadvantage to perhaps a pedagogy of desire and possibility. Secondly, doing away with the structures, the relational structures, the hierarchical relational structures that we have created in universities, and moving away from the so-called table. And thirdly, unearthing or challenging the silences and the silencing that exists within universities.
Okay. Thanks very much, Tshepo, and thanks to Lebo and Sharon. So, it's come up twice here now this morning about doing away with the table. Lebo has now raised it, and Suming raised it a little earlier. Tshepo, you also spoke about never being able to decolonize these kinds of spaces. So I'd like to start off by talking about this difficulty of reconstituting the imaginary. And to make the point that recognizing that difficulty about reconstituting the imaginary is the task that we pedagogically and philosophically have to come to terms with. It's the task of the moment. Central in that task is that question that Michael raised earlier on about how are you going to do this? How are you going to embark on this task of doing something different? And I'd like to start off by saying to you that the university is never and has never been an homogeneous, singular, long-range project which you can talk about in terms which are undifferentiated. There are always, in universities, always processes, individuals, things that are not going to fall into rhythm, into line with whatever the dominant position is. And to say to all of you, people have always struggled with insiderliness, outsiderliness inside of universities. It takes different form in different kinds of contexts. The context here is this extreme racial form that it exists, but it's always been a factor which universities and people in universities have had to deal with. It's about how master signifiers operate in these kinds of spaces, and recognizing what those master signifiers are, and how you deal with the difficulty of coping with a master signifier. Excuse the gendered language, but it is exactly that. It's masculine, it is ageist, it is colored in very particular pigmented kinds of ways. It comes with voices of different forms and accents and so on. And all of those things are operating in that kind of space in which you find yourself. So you can be darn sure that at any single moment somebody's going to be feeling left out, right? You can be darn sure that at any moment these master signifiers are in creative ways remaking themselves, listening to the resistance, dealing with the resistance, adjusting, and recomposing themselves. And this is what's happening now with this decoloniality stuff. So you're in a really complicated space, and how you begin to work in this space is, I think, this task which we are having to confront. Because I'd like to say to you, these master signifiers are so seductive. To be white is so great, It is such a difficult thing to move away from that particular dominance. People like being white, right? People say, I'm white. When people say I'm white, I get really nervous, So as an affective desire, it really makes me anxious. It's the same thing when people make these confessions. They start writing, I confess in this to my power, I am a white male, and the whole trope begins to be unfolded and unrolled, and you think, now, okay, I've done with the confession, now I can continue being dominant. So how do you begin to think about ways of undoing all of this? And I'll say to you, this master signifier of whiteness is an incredible thing. It is encased in so much desire that all the forms of resistance in relation to it are about that desire. And so the forms of blackness that we see in response to it are a reaction to that desire. So we're needing to think really hard about how do you undo this stuff, right? How do you begin to take a position in relation to it which imagines this boundary, these alternatives in completely kinds of new ways? How do you begin to confront this real difficulty of the university as being a space that should not be bounded in any kind of way? How do you get to that real difficulty of being able to, yes, honor the fact that it is a place of reason, right? How do we come to a sense of making that process of reason and the making of how you formulate an argument the primary thing, which is what a university should be for, the primary thing, nothing else? How do you do that? How do you pedagogically start this process, you say, Suming, of going into a sociology class? And I'll say to you, I'm a sociologist. Sociology has failed us, right? How do you go into a sociology class and tell these students that the concepts that we have are not equal and adequate to the task that is in front of us of explaining how power works? How do you do that? And where do you begin? And so you're in a real moment of difficulty here, and it has to be in terms of looking at what the field is saying. You cannot avoid that. You cannot avoid this engagement with what the... So I've been in many situations now where people say, I'm not going to listen to you if you talk about Foucault. They'll say to you, rather tell me about what rap can help me understand about how the human experience operates. And I'll say we're in real trouble at that moment, colleagues. So you have to deal with Foucault. You have to. But you have to push yourself to the point where you can tell Foucault how problematic Foucault is. Right? You've got to stare Foucault in the face and say to him that your biopolitics is actually, in many kinds of ways, a reaffirmation of this whiteness. How are you going to do that? By skipping Foucault now? Right? How are you going to do that? So we're at this moment where we've got to be thinking about this regeneration of how this table works. And I'd say to you that from the very beginning of universities, you would have had people who had a sense of that and who were doing the alternative already. 200 years ago. They were doing it. So there would always have been people running in opposition to what the dominance of the space is all about. So the university, in looking into itself, is this multiplicitous space of these multiplicitous kinds of practices. So how do we make these multiplicitous practices speak to these master signifiers? Right? So you've just got to think now about how I am going to be, how I'm going to carry myself in the space of this complexity. Right? How am I going to manage myself in a way which acknowledges the weight of this master signifier and is able to embody and live, not to look into the future, but be in the present an alternative. I mean, how in the present can you begin to express what that alternative is all about? And I'd like to say to you, it's entirely possible, colleagues. It's entirely possible. Of course, you're going to stub your toe at every corner. You're going to be making mistakes. Your language will let you down. Your frameworks will betray their origins. But you've got to be trying to be the alternative. And being that alternative is acknowledging that the boundaries, that these discourses and the limits that come with them are ones that you are politically going to have to deal with, but that you're going to have to construct for yourself new objects of desire. And how you do that, colleagues, how you do that is what it is that we're needing to kind of think and get our heads around. And it's not about whiteness, it's not about blackness, it's not about being a preferred male, it's not about getting to a particular age of gravitas, It is not about how you speak, it's about that dignity that is inside of you. And how you're able to make that dignity the critical thing which comes to what marks who you are. Thanks, Tshepo.
Thank you. We have a lot of time. I have an hour. We have an hour. So I'm not going to summarize what the three speakers said. I hope all of you were taking notes. But I thought the three speakers really spoke in one language, in a sense. I mean, we started off with Sharon talking about the notion of emancipation, not as repair, but as rupture. Emancipation as rupture. And of course, that famous line from Cisse, End of the World. You remember that stanza. We need to start. Start what? The end of the world, for heaven's sake. The end of the world, for heaven's sake. So the notion of emancipation as de-linking. But of course, there's a danger here, and you see it in our decolonial discourse, where de-linking means withdrawing into our own world, our own ghetto. We need to de-link from Western modernity, from Western ways of doing the world, of being in the world, but without withdrawing to our own ghetto. And of course, Cisse has to be read together with his 1956 resignation letter from the Communist Party. Remember when he resigned from the Communist Party? He said, I'm resigning, but I'm not withdrawing from universalism. I'm withdrawing from disembodied universalism. Disembodied universalism. I want to engage with the universe, but from my position, from my standpoint. So the question here being, this notion of delinking emancipation as withdrawing from we need to be careful. In fact, Ngugi's book, Globalectic, very, very important book, Globalectic. How do we engage in the dialectic of the global, from the here to the there? Not from the there to the here, globalectics. And then the second speaker, the notion of a caution against pedagogy of the disadvantaged. I don't know if this is the same as pedagogy of the oppressed, because you see, Ferrer said pedagogy of the oppressed is emancipation, but maybe this is not the same as pedagogy of disadvantage. And how often, and you see it all the time, where we are struggling for access, for inclusion, but really we're struggling for assimilation. We want to access the table. We don't want to change things. Tshepo wants to be appointed somewhere, but without changing things. You know, accessing the table. And here we are reminded of Biko. Biko says, what does the end of the world mean for Steve Biko? The end of the world for Steve Biko, of course, plagiarizing Banda, is that we need to wipe the table clean. He says, what is day one of Azania? What is day one of Azania? The difference between Azania and the new South Africa. What is day one of Azania? We wipe the table clean, we put our own things, and then we can include other knowledges. We can include Foucault, we can include Derrida, but from our own standpoint. In fact, the notion of what do we do with the other Europe, not the Central Europe, but the other Europe, Derrida, Foucault, Hannah Arendt, Benjamin, and the others. Do we say they're not needed, Karl Marx, in our new project? I don't think so. I don't think so. And this is what Anton Lebede spoke about. Anton Lebede, the father of African nationalism in South Africa. The difference between being borrowed and being assimilated, and borrowing and assimilating from your own position. So I really I like that. Foucault, to go over Foucault, because we know Foucault wrote as if Algeria was not happening, even though Algeria was happening, but he spoke as if Algeria was not happening. I'm saying too much again. The floor is open. Dr. B? Can you, sorry? Clap for me, no. So thank you to the three speakers. We have about 40 minutes. We'll start with 1, 2, 3. Dr. B?
Okay, thank you so much, Tshepo. I don't know about the desire to be white, though. In terms of decolonization, I don't know. I might have misheard you, but my understanding about the decolonial discourse, which has been co-opted in a way, as you're rightly putting it, we had a moment of rupture in South Africa twice, 1976, 2015. What happened was the same co-optation of the resistance, you know. And also, in terms of my understanding, actually, is that we are not striving, we don't have a desire to be white. We are desiring a pluriversity, not a university. A space whereby we can have plurality as the norm. But now, when we are again going back to try and be reductionist in a way, to say that we desire this particular, you know, culture to be dominant. But anyway, those are my few comments, that there is always a cooptation after rupture, unfortunately. And how do we avoid that? But also, I no longer believe that we need to have a uni. This is what Tisani has said. We need a pluriversity in many ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. How does the pluri-university avoid epistemological populism, where everything goes? We should also be careful. 1, 2.
Yes. I just want to respond to Lebo about this notion of dropping, so to say, the name historically disadvantaged. And my argument is that if we are not constructively engaging in the space of emancipation, and therefore there's an absence in terms of how we critique the critical scholarship, and also the understanding that these universities we're dealing with in order to free ourselves with marginality and the undermining of a black scholar within this space So it's not a question of us just dropping it and coming up with a new name. And we don't desire, actually, to be Wits. I want to remain UniZulu. And if in my construction of being a University of Zululand scholar, I'm undermined in the space, therefore, the issues of emancipation are actually against me, then I need to retain that. If you look at the historical disadvantaged institutions, you need to think about, we can't forget the history in how we construct ourselves, not that we want to reproduce it, but we want to come against it by constructively engaging and saying, what is the alter? I don't want to be renamed by somebody. I want to construct my own identity as I go through my history and doing things differently. No, wait a little bit. So my question is, I see where you're going. My question is, if you look at who termed us historically disadvantaged, where was that coming from after 1996? You look at who I was before 1996, and I'm saying we are in a transition, but we need to come up with our own content. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both for your responses. I just have a question. I think it's Prof. Soudien. For you, you mentioned rap, and it just sparked something in me because I'm in English literature. But the way that I came to English literature wasn't through Foucault, it wasn't through Shakespeare, it was through hip-hop and rap. My first understanding of a metaphor was through Nas, through Biggie, through Queen Latifah, through Ra Digger, Salt and Pepper. That was my introduction to the wonder of literature, to literature touching you on the inside part, where Shakespeare was speaking about all these things, and Foucault, I mean, like, Foucault's never provoked in me the kind of response that music has provoked in me. You know, I've never felt about Foucault and sat back and thought about the black-bodied experience and started crying or started really contemplating or having a creative kind of, how do I respond to my world? The way that I do when I listen to Nina Simone's Strange Fruit. And so I want to know, like, when are we going to get away from this thing where we can only come at the issue in one way? You know, and that Foucault is the way that we're going to give integrity, because we also have to question this thing of, he's been given his integrity and legitimated by this system that we are now trying to decolonize, but at the same time we want to question alternative ways of approaching the process of decolonizing the system. So, yeah, I just like a response to that.
Clear. Last question, and then we go back to the speakers.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. Sitting here in the audience almost felt like I have to get a seat in the Last Supper. Okay, so let me come back to aspects of emancipation and rebellion. I want to share a small story, very short, in the sense more as a comment, that really speaking, in India, at one point of time, we were looking at how to progress and develop really fast. Today, India is one of the third largest economy in the world. We had a group of colleagues together who said, every time a budget is presented, it's crap. It doesn't help the common people. What can we do as academics? We said, let's create our own budget. So a group of economists got together and prepared exactly an alternative budget and presented to the government, went to the media and said, here's an alternative, okay? So that was sort of emancipation approaches that we're taking. So my question to the group is, what are the first principles, if I'm looking as a lawyer here, what are the first principles of emancipation that we would like to establish before we start dismantling or remantling the imaginary, number one. The second aspect is in terms of the corporatization of the university, that all universities are speaking the same language. The neoliberal agenda is established. Every university has the same vision statement with fine tuning here and there. So if you look at the vision statement of all universities in the global south, you'll find, and in the global north, you'll find exactly the same words. So where's the distinction? Thank you.
Thank you. We don't deserve to be white. We don't want Foucault. The language of disadvantage, we still want it. And then Sharon, you also got your question.
Okay. So it's of course important to acknowledge these forms of alternatives that are current and going on as you speak at any one moment in time. You represent it. I'm talking about how you sit in relation to these master signifiers. The master signifier is what it is, the politics of which we are needing to come to terms with. And so that alternative that you represent is a really important thing. Now, how do you multiply that? I think that's the question. How do you make that become a form of practice that develops, and it'll develop its own orthodoxy, and so put itself up for, if you like, critique in its own kind of way, but do it. Just do it. You know, push that, push it. And so I'd like to say to you, you know, colleagues, the pluri-university is always in motion. The visibility of the plurality of it is going to be an issue, but it's in that politics that you have to play. Now let me talk about Foucault. Colleagues, I'm not saying Foucault is the only way you're going to come to any sense of awareness. You know, you're going to come to a sense of awareness in a whole range of different kinds of ways. It could come through anything. You know, you could come to a sense of possibility through multiple sensory experiences that are going to come to you, you know, in many kinds of ways. I'm just saying to you that you have to, in the space now, and so let's talk about multiplicity. You have to know a lot about a lot. You have to be able to speak into and be literate in ways that are not expected of street talk. You know, so it's absolutely critical that you do all of these things at the same time. You know, it's absolutely critical now, for example, that we understand how popular culture is reconstituting the kind of intellectual space of the present, and to engage with that in really kinds of critical kinds of ways. You know, so it's asking to have that whole table that is in front of you as fully decked as you can make it. You want the plentifulness, that the abundance that is around there to be on that table with all of its difficulty.
I'm responding to my sister there from UNIZUL. And I think I didn't express myself very well. You said exactly what I meant to say, that UNIZUL and Forte do not want to be Wits, but they want to be Forte and UNIZUL. You also pointed out one of the things that I've been thinking. I'm a graduate of a very proud graduate of the University of Forte. And when I was at Forte, Forte wasn't a disadvantaged university. In fact, it was an elite university. Ironically, it was the post-apartheid government which designated it as a disadvantaged university. And since then, we have never looked back. It has been a downward spiral. Yes. And what I'm arguing is the words we use to identify ourselves somehow turn into like self-fulfilling prophecies. So I'm asking us to name ourselves, not to have the government name us, not to have vets name us, but to name ourselves in words that reflect our desire to be something bigger than the words, the current words that describe us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sharon?
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. So from the analysis that I work with in my research group, it's not really a question of making a rupture happen. It's more of the sense that it's going to happen. It's happened. We have a metaphor of the house modernity built, and our analysis is it's crumbling. So it's not something we need to push. And as it's crumbling, that doesn't mean you stop the work of reducing harm for those inside it, and you don't stop the fighting in the soft and radical reform spaces. But thinking about how, if it and when it crumbles, something else might be possible, I really resonate with the emphasis on desire and the need to rearrange people's desires, because again, I think rearranging their thinking is something that I think we've managed to do fairly well, although it's not always a success. But if you don't shift the level of investment in the entitlements that modernity has given the modern subject, then, and you see really quickly, once a crisis happens, or it's not even happening, but they perceive it happening, then you see where people really are. And asking them to give up willingly all of the things that they would have to give up for another world to be possible without the house crumbling, a few people are willing, and when they are, it's really exciting, and even then you see the resistance. But I'm not sure until that happens, until there's no other choice, something else will be possible. So it's an open question pedagogically, how to prepare people for that moment. So I'm looking for ideas.
Is the point to dismantle the master's house or to build our own houses?
Thank you very much. I think it is both simultaneously. And to hold both of them together is what the challenge is. So my question is that if we want to, and I agree that we should establish or re-establish an imaginary that instantiates a new mode of reasoning as the raison d'etre of the university. If we agree on that, then the comment that one wants to make is that the constitutive basis for that emerging mode of reasoning is just not emerging. We are in, I think you call it, in a populist space. I want to say we are in multiple modes of reasoning who's struggling to kind of reconstitute itself. So my question is simply this: how do you begin to grab at these multiplicities to establish that reimagined mode of reasoning?
Thank you for make us continue thinking about how to destabilize what is the hegemonic in a way. And I think that my question is rather a pragmatic question, because we all the ones that are here are doing this work of dismantling or challenging, and my question is rather, what kind of collective force do we have? So I'm doing the work of decolonizing sociology, and I'm seeing my students telling me, why don't you continue with Marx and Durkheim? And giving me the feedback in a German university that this is not sociology, what I'm doing. So the question is rather, because the things are happening already, and I think this is a struggle. So it's not anymore, I think, of this, let's say, more Occidental liberal idea of this scholar that is in the room doing its new research project. This is what's happening in society, the different struggles are going on, the voices that are appearing also in the university and pushing these voices out again from the university. So I'm interested in the collective struggle that you are in. In Canada, what is happening there on the level of institution, not just on the level of the research groups? How is this dismantling of knowledge becoming part of a bigger force? You were talking about local knowledge as recognized knowledge, actually as analytical knowledge. What is happening on the level of the institution to say, well, it doesn't matter, this Wits it's another university, and we have this tradition. So, because we were talking about, we need force, we need to strengthen us in order to continue. And so I think it's not just about Foucault. So it's not about this individual scholar. So what is happening also in universities that appear in the international ranking and get the plus points? What kind of collective organizing is happening?
Thank you. For a change, I bring solutions. I would like to, I'm thinking about the sociological concepts. Professor Soudien says when they no longer work, what do we do? The little bit that I learned from sociology is that concepts are developed from an understanding. So we go out there, we look, we try to understand, and we come up with concepts so that we can use them to provide the understanding. At University of Cape Town, at midnight, Max Price, genuinely exasperated at what to do with the students. But we've listened to them. We've done what they wanted to do. They always change the game. They always change what they want. What are we supposed to do? And one of the suggestions was actually just listen and try to understand. Try to understand them from the position from which they come. Try to understand the real situation that they confront in their communities and in the position that they occupy in society. And I don't know if Professor Bauer is still here. I want to challenge, and this is my solution, I want to challenge an organ or a body like University of South Africa to sit at the round table with all the universities, all the 25 universities of South Africa, to deal with the challenges that his so-called historically disadvantaged universities face. Because if I'm sitting at Nelson Mandela University and I'm saying 80% of the researchers are white, this is a problem, we need to change this. But if I go to Fort Hare, there's no such problem, it's a different problem. But nobody's speaking about the kind of problems that these so-called historically disadvantaged universities are having because they don't understand them. They don't know them. They don't bother to look deep into what constituted them, how this constitution has changed, and how it continues to change so that today we understand the problems and come up with the real solutions that will change for real and make meaningful impact to the sector. Thank you.
What is the solution? That's the solution.
Hi, I just want to dramatize a little bit the issue, the question, the point that Crain made at the end. Whatever you're doing, do something about it. So do something about it. In 1996, 95 and 96, when the National Commission for Higher Education released its report, a group of critical scholars, and they were predominantly black scholars, gathered at the University of Venda. And because they were opposed to that particular document, a professor from Kenya, if I remember, he stood up, Professor William Mahoba was the chair. He said, I've taught in so many countries, US, all over the place. Now I'm teaching here. My major problem with we as Africans is we complain, and very often do very little about it. Then he pointed to Professor Mahoba, who was chairing. He said, he's in a position of power, but he's still complaining. Do something about it. Then, years later, at the University of Fort Hare, again, another initiative took place, sponsored by the HSRC, looking for an alternative, an institution that could provide support to this, I don't want to use the word disadvantage, but that was the issue. A new institution was created, SOSRDEF, Social Science Research Council. It took off and then died. Today, we are discussing exactly the same thing. And I think that this call, do something about it, is very serious.
Do you want to go? Can I go? Okay, so let me just make a big point. So we've been talking now quite intensely for the last 15 years around the world about the university. But actually we don't have a theory, we don't have a sociological theory of the university. So there's this guy, Martin Trau, and I've used him. How many of you are familiar with Martin Trau? T-R-O-W. Okay, T-R-O-W. So he's written what is probably the key text to help one understand how to approach the sociology of what a university is all about. Okay? It's useful at some levels, but it doesn't help one in terms of understanding a whole lot of issues. He's the person who spoke about the problems of massification. You know, he spoke about what happens when universities, when the composition of the university moves from being elite to mass, and how, you know, particular difficulties arise inside of the university. Now, just that is a very useful attempt to try to explain the distinctiveness sociologically of what a university is all about. We're needing to develop new frameworks now to come to explain and make distinct the nature of a university from the nature of a school, from the nature of a prison, from the nature of a hospital, and so on. So it's really crucial that theoretical work is begun and undertaken to give a sense of who is in the university, what the university is for, what the kinds of dynamics are that operate and circulate inside of a university around how the university and the purposes of what the university are for. So I'd like to say to you that what's happening now is that we're bringing often, to try to understand what's going on here, a whole lot of vantage perspectives from a whole lot of other spaces that are not appropriate for understanding just the specificity of the complexity of what that space is all about. And the making of knowledge is the key issue that you have to come to understand in that sociology. I mean, how does this thing of knowledge making get managed with the people who are there and what the people who are there do with it? I just want to say, Tshepo, that it's absolutely crucial because, you know, we often say that the university mirrors society, but it's not a sociologically clean alignment. You know, the alignment is not so straightforward. You know, so just beginning with the descriptive terms of what this thing that you are talking about, I think could be a useful thing. Once you've done that, you can then begin to look at what the features of, you know, this particular thing, you know, might be, how you might begin to analyze the dynamics in those features, and come to a sense of how power operates in that kind of space. You know, so of course it's true that universities are often conveyor belts of social structures outside of the university, right? The university comes to be a place which simply reproduces elitism that you have outside of the university. And in a country like South Africa, the social structure of the broader society is reproduced in the social structure, you know, of the university. But it's not the same thing, you know. So we really, I think, are in an important space of demand. And there's a lot asked of us, Michael. So, you know, a lot of us are working this. A lot is being asked of us, you know, right now. And we've got to step up. We have to step up and start talking in unapologetic terms about making things clear. It's going to come across as arrogance. It will. But you've got to deal with just how the politics of the relationship of the university to the broader world operates, and deal with that, and come to confront the difficult things that will emerge, out of doing that analysis. If we don't do that analysis, we're going to be using all sorts of ways of coming to understand this problem, which are fine for some things, but not for this whole thing.
Responding to your question about collective struggle, the collective struggle, I don't see any in the South African context, or even in the African context. I think, as I said earlier, the neoliberal project doesn't encourage or enable collective struggle. It encourages competition. Hence the rankings, hence the institutional performance units with which academics are measured. And so the space doesn't really allow for collective struggle and collective imagination of what could be possible. And maybe that's where we need to start. And to Michael's do something about it, I want to go back to Forte and institutions like Forte, and link that to what happened to the US after the end of their apartheid system and what they did with the black universities. What did they do? They built them. They pumped resources into them. Not the government, but civil society pumped resources. What did we do with our fortes? We killed them. And instead we took resources and pumped them into UCTs and Wits and all of that. That is where the resources are going. So that is a practical thing that we could have done. We missed an opportunity, but I think it's not too late. We can still turn things around and really resource universities like this to make them into useful institutions for the South African context.
To answer the question about collective struggle, in my institution, there's very little. In Canada, overall, there's more, depending on where you are. But I think all of the available modes of including collective struggle are still modes of struggle that presume the continuity of the house. And so I think, again, while it still stands, we can and should work with them, but always holding open the space for other forms of politics that we actually can't imagine yet. Because I don't think it's just that we're not imagining things and we can from here, but that certain things that are viable and possible remain unimaginable for those of us who are still rooted within a colonial frame. The other thing I just wanted to say was that I think Sue was talking about some of the fantasies that people in higher education have about, for instance, our role in meritocracy and other things. And I think that critical scholars also have our own fantasies. And so my kind of urging is, as we formulate or reformulate whatever we're calling what we're doing collectively together, critical university studies or African critical university studies, is that we always keep envision the thing that we would rather not see. And there's some ways in which we have to kind of sometimes move with these fantasies to make things possible, but we should always remember that we're doing that and that we're bracketing something to make something possible, but that we need to keep in view the thing we don't want to see that's not convenient, that is about our complicity, that is about the complexity. That's not always something we can strategically keep at the fore, but that in these kinds of meetings we can do.
Thank you. Last person. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Professor Crain, Crain, yeah. I think we need to understand this resistance in context. And I think I've been listening to you until you came to this notion of multiple literacy. And this is where I'm going to have a problem. Because if we are going to be talking about this multiple literacy, and for me, I think somehow whiteness is one of the master signifier, because you're calling the master signifier, I'm using your concept here, that is actually illiterate about the world. That whiteness does not care about knowing other worlds. And therefore, how will we appreciate this multiple literacy? It's going to be very difficult. Because that's why you see the resistance. The resistance has to be understood in context. And embedded in this assumption is the notion of multiple literacy. Is also the assumption that somehow this rejection, maybe, or this is problematic because when people reject Foucault, it becomes problem. But when people reject Achuma Feje, it's normal. So I think this is where this notion of multiple literacy is giving me a problem. And I think I want you to expand on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to also join the conversation, Crain, about the work has to be done at some point. And simply, again, draw on history. So perhaps two quick examples come to mind. The first, of course, was the Ibadan school. Alongside it, we had the Dhaka school, and we had the school based at Dar es Salaam. And so I think there are three examples of what is possible. And we just need to go back to that homework. And remember, these are all not, or put differently, these are not infallible. The second example, with all its own foibles and challenges and weaknesses here in South Africa, was of course the efforts to reimagine people's education. And so in that context, again, all its flaws, we focused our minds on math, English, and history. And we put together task teams to begin to reimagine and rethink those three subjects, or call them subjects or themes of learning and knowledge. And then at the dawn of this new democracy of ours, as part of the National Education Crisis Committee, we forged an outfit called the National Education Policy Investigation, or NEPI. And again, we put together a wide range, Crain of intellectuals, of left-thinking intellectuals. And so I'm simply saying it is not impossible. And I can appreciate the importance of shadow boxing. Yeah? I can appreciate, you feigning, you making as if you're going to engage, and then you don't engage. And I appreciate that it's necessary for us to build up confidence. But at the same time, it is time for us to begin to take that next step, drawing on the experiences across our continent and here in South Africa as well. So let's have courage.
Thank you.
How is the mic support? Okay, thank you. Mama, I just want to touch back on your point on Lekgotla, that we need to ensure that some voices are brought to the fore. You spoke about silence and silencing, and I think that's a very critical space that we are in. We have these dialogues, we have this conversation, but nothing happens. There is no shift.
In fact, I'm reminded of the song, The Sounds of Silence, and I just want to go back to the song. It says, "Fools said, you do not know silence like the cancer grows." And why the phone sounds a bit heavy. No, I can sing. But part of the song, it actually say, "And in the naked light I saw 10,000 people, maybe more, people talking without speaking, people hearing without listening, and people writing songs that voices never share, and no one dares disturbs the sounds of silence." And it's very disturbing that if you look into our institution, silence can also be a way of preserving oneself, because it's very taxing to continuously be talking about the same thing. But the silencing can also be about power. It can also be who is around. Can I speak out? Because if I speak out, then I'll be pointed at. So a part of me, I like, if you go into indigenous knowledge, you talk about this lekgotla, you are recognized in that space. But the reality in the spaces that we are finding ourselves in, we are not recognized. It's not about what I'm saying, but who is saying what they are saying. So my question, how do we shift these spaces so that we bring the voices to the fore?
Thank you. Two last questions. You don't want it anymore.
Thank you for allowing me to follow up. Prof. Soudien, I'm not fighting with you, but I just want to follow up with you.
I am very...
Are you open to being fought with? No problem, I can do that. I just wanted to say, what is street talk, Prof? I just want to know, because you mentioned that there are certain concepts that can't come through in street talk. And what is that division? What kind of English is that? Especially because English itself is like a mongrel language, and we forget that. And we forget that all these colonial languages that we are forced to speak in or teach about, they themselves will street talk or whatever else you want to label this high-low division. So and it's a genuine question that I'm grappling with. How are we going to deal with this perception? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Can you answer those questions and then have your final remarks? If we are going to reconstitute the imagination, who is the constitutive power?
Sorry, I don't know your name. Edith. So, Edith, I can hear in simply using that particular expression how pejorative it might come across. Okay? But I'd like to come back to what Aslam is talking about modes of reasoning. And say to you that it is the job of a privileged space like the university to be concentrating on these modes of reasoning. So you want to be able to put these modes of reasoning into an explicit, articulate form as you can. And it's if that's what the university is really for, it's a hell of a good thing. Then you want to massify and make every space in the world a university. If that's what we're after, and it's simply saying to you that the authority of ordinary conversation with its own forms of, if you like, authorization and so on, is something that we simply need to be understanding how those things work. So I'm going to tell you it's like this because I'm older than you, or because of, and so, what modes of power are being invoked in any of those spaces is what trying to come to understand how modes of reasoning work and what's going on inside of them. It's not saying that modes of reasoning might not have great wisdom. You might have incredible insight in that kind of space. But we're needing to think about how we think better for saving the world. Because the problems are so complicated that we have to find better and better ways of coming to solve our problems. And if we can teach people to be thinking better, from the minute that they are beginning to articulate words as they're growing up, if that's university, that's great. If that's what a university is, great. So that's the big point that I want to make to you, Edith. Sorry, I don't know your name also. I think I have met you before. Pardon? Nancy. So Nancy, no, so it wasn't you, Nancy, it was somebody else behind you talking about. So let me just say, colleagues, you don't want to not know how complexity works. You don't want to not know how power works. You don't want to not know how evil works. You have to be making it almost a burden of knowing to come to understand complexity. So, just talking very personally, very quickly, I discovered in the last few months Afrikaner sociology, and it was a big thing for me. I came to understand how this country has come to be philosophically constituted as a result of 1948 in ways that I would never have understood before. And it was through the discovery of a man called Geoffrey Cronje. Geoffrey Cronje was the sociologist who came to the University of Pretoria in 1936. He's the person who establishes one of the first social work departments in the country and the first criminology department in 1958. What this man does is come to begin to lay out in ways that are not visible to all of us here this inner logic of raciology for what South Africa is all about. And it's absolutely extraordinary. How many people know Geoffrey Cronje? Right? So you're in a really critical phase of coming to understand this power and the intricacies of the logics of this power, and it's our obligation to become literate about these things.
So linked to that then, the university as a social project. So the apartheid regime knew exactly what the university was meant to do for the country. So in reimagining the university for a democratic South Africa, what do we want? A few years ago, I can't remember whether it was here, Andre, or it was at the Free State, where we were talking about education for the public good. And recently I was in a seminar with my graduate students who I was asking, so what is education for the public good? And I was struck by the number of concepts they took. So they were talking about diversity, about inclusion, and about emancipation, but nothing about freedom. And so I think freedom for us in the post-apartheid dispensation is a key concept and a key issue that we need to grapple with. I was just adding to what you were saying. In terms of addressing the silences and the silencing, I think there are several ways we can think about the silence and the silence. As people have said, silence is not always negative. Silence can be very productive. And so thinking of how we use and how we engage silence in university spaces can help us think about how we challenge the power dynamics in the institution so that we can unsilence other people. What do I mean by that? But for now, I don't have a practical solution or a practical strategy about how we address the silence. Just to say that the first step is to think of silence as not only negative, but silence as potentially productive, performative, and actually very loud. Silence can be loud.
Okay, I think I just have to, in honor of like what I have learned from Indigenous people in Canada and Latin America, even though I'm like less than a toddler in terms of my understanding of these knowledge systems, that if we're thinking about something you said, like what's the constitutive power that is centering this reimagining of the university, and not like there's one homogenous Indigenous voice, of course, but the message I get is that actually we need to center the earth itself. It's not about centering this group of people or that, because we're all not enough, but also indispensable. But it can't be any human group that is at the center. It's actually the living earth. That's not a property. That's not something to be possessed, but rather, yeah, Pachamama in Quechua. So I don't think we have any idea, at least in Canada, what that would look like, but this is a message that I keep getting, so I thought I would put it on the table.
Thank you. Let's give our speakers a hand. Time for lunch. We'll be coming back exactly at 28 minutes past.
And last one, just so we can it's a finger lunch.
Oh, the finger lunch.
Just over here.